The invitation arrived sealed in silver wax, and Sovereign Vesperis knew before she broke it open that it would wound her. She had learned in the 4 years since her family's name had been dragged through the mud of every drawing room in the county that gilded paper often carried the sharpest cruelty. She tilted the card to the candlelight and read it twice. The Winter Assembly, the grandest gathering the cliffside duchy had seen in a generation, held in the great glass conservatories where the rain fell endlessly against the panes and the silver sea churned far below. "They have invited us only to watch us stumble," her aunt said from the doorway, her voice thin with worry. "You know who will be there." "I know," Sovereign answered. She set the card down with steady hands. "And I will go regardless. Let them watch. I have nothing left to be ashamed of." It was the winter of 1847, and in England a woman's worth was weighed in reputation as carefully as a merchant weighed gold. 4 years before, her father, Lord Ansel Vesperis, had been accused of cheating the men he traded with, and the accusation had broken him. The debts came due, the friends vanished, and within a single season, he was in his grave. Sovereign had never doubted the charge. She had wept for him, and she had been ashamed of him, and she had set herself the long labor of rebuilding a name she believed he had stained by his own hand. She sold the horses. She dismissed the servants she could not pay. She taught herself to mend her own gowns by lamplight until her fingers ached, and she did it without complaint and without begging a single favor. What she did not yet know was that the charge against her father had been a lie, and that the man who first spoke that lie would be standing in the room she was about to enter, smiling, beloved, and watching her with the patience of a wolf. Duke Caelan Thorncroft stood that same evening before the tall mirrors of his apartments while his valet adjusted the line of his coat. He was a man who had never been refused. Wealth had been laid in his cradle, power pressed into his hands before he could walk, an untouchable name fixed to him at birth. He was admired everywhere for his charm, and he had come to believe that admiration was a kind of ownership. "The Vesperis girl will be present tonight," his secretary noted carefully. "The one with the ruined father." Caelan smiled at his own reflection. "I hear she is handsome enough, despite the disgrace. It would be a kindness to lift her out of the gutter. Any woman would weep with gratitude for such an offer. My lord, I would advise caution. She is said to be proud." "Pride," Caelan said, "is a luxury the poor cannot afford." The conservatories blazed with 1,000 candles when Sovereign arrived. Light spilled through the curved glass and scattered across the marble like fallen stars. The most influential families of the kingdom moved beneath the palms and the orange trees, jewels glittering, laughter rising and falling like the tide. At the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy of white roses grown out of season, sat the Dowager Duchess Mireia Thorncroft, straight-backed and silver-haired, her dark eyes missing nothing. And near her stood Lord Halvard Brevenshaw, a man the whole court trusted, spoken of in every parlour as the very conscience of the kingdom, a pillar of honour whom no one would ever dream to suspect of anything at all. Sovereign wore a gown of deep blue, plain beside the silks around her, yet she carried herself as though she wore a crown. Heads turned. Whispers followed her like the hiss of the sea against the rocks below. "That is Vesperis' daughter. How dare she show her face? And yet how lovely she is." What she did not see was the way the Dowager Duchess went very still at the sound of her name, nor the way Lord Brevenshaw's gaze followed her across the room with the cold attention of a man watching an old grave, listening for any sound beneath the earth. She found a quiet corner near the tall windows, where the rain traced silver rivers down the glass, and there she might have stayed the whole evening had the Duke not crossed the floor toward her with the slow confidence of a man who has never once been told no. "Lady Sovereign," he said, bowing just enough to be polite and not enough to be sincere. "I have heard a great deal about your family's misfortunes. It must be a heavy thing to carry such a name." "It is the only name I have," she replied evenly. "I carry it as I must." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she had not lowered her gaze. He was used to women who blushed and fluttered. This one met his look as though they stood upon level ground. I have a proposal that may interest you, he went on. A woman in your position cannot hope for much. But I am not without generosity. Marry me, and your debts vanish. Your aunt is provided for. Your name, ruined as it is, becomes mine, and mine is beyond reproach. You would never want for anything again. The music seemed to dim. Those nearest had heard, and they leaned in, hungry for the spectacle. Sivrain studied him. The fine cut of his coat, the careless pride in the set of his jaw. A man who had offered her not his heart, but his pity, and who expected her to fall to her knees in thanks for it. You honor me with such calculation, she said softly. But I must decline. The silence that followed was sharp as breaking glass. Decline? Kalen repeated. He laughed, but the sound had already gone brittle. You cannot mean it. Do you understand what I am offering you? Do you understand what you are? I understand perfectly, she said. I am a woman who would rather keep her self-respect than purchase comfort with it. I do not wish to be your charity, your grace. I wish to be no one. Heat climbed his face. He had been refused in public by a girl whose family could not pay its own butcher, and the wound to his pride was unbearable. Like all men who have never learned to lose, he reached for cruelty to cover it. You think yourself so very fine, he said, his voice rising so that half the room could hear. But you are nothing, a pretty face fixed to a beggar's name. Do not flatter yourself that I want you. He turned then, speaking to the crowd as much as to her, and the words left his mouth before sense could call them back. I could marry 100 women like her. The ballroom fell silent. The musicians lowered their bows. The laughter died in 100 throats. Even the rain seemed to pause against the glass. Sivrain stood very still, her chin lifted, and though her heart slammed against her ribs, she did not let a single tear fall. She would not give him that. She would give him nothing at all. Then a movement at the far end of the hall drew every eye. The Dowager Duchess Mireia rose from her seat beneath the white roses. She crossed the marble slowly, her cane striking the stone with each step, and the crowd parted before her like water before the prow of a ship. She stopped before her son. She looked at him with an expression no one in that hall would ever forget, and those who stood closest swore afterward that it was not anger alone in her face, but something older and far heavier, something very near to grief. And then she struck him across the face. The sound cracked through the conservatory like a falling branch. Kalen's head snapped to the side. A gasp went up from every corner. A duchess fainted near the orange trees, and 100 of the kingdom's most powerful nobles stood frozen, unable to believe what they had seen. You could search 100 lifetimes, the Dowager Duchess said, her voice ringing clear and terrible, and never deserve one like her. She turned from her son as though he were a stranger to her and offered Sivrain her arm. Come, child. The air in this room has grown foul. Sivrain took the old woman's arm. Together they walked the length of the silent hall, past the gaping nobles and the trembling candles, past Lord Brevenshaw, who alone among them did not look amused, and out into the cold and honest rain. That night, alone in her small room at the inn, Sivrain did not weep. She sat at the window and watched the storm lash the cliffs, and for the first time in 4 long years she felt entirely free. She would not stay in Bramblemere Hollow to be pitied or to be whispered over. She would not wait to see whether the Duke might one day deign to apologize. By morning, she had decided, she would go where no one knew her father's name, where she might be measured by nothing but the woman she had made of herself. The Dowager Duchess came to the inn before she left, and pressed a letter of introduction into her hands at the door. Where will you go? Mireia asked. To the city, Sivrain answered. I have a fine hand, and a good head for figures. A woman may make her own way, if she is willing to work. The old woman held her gaze for a long moment, and there was something behind her eyes that pressed against her lips and would not be let out. In the end, she only touched the girl's cheek. Your father, she began. Then she stopped and seemed to gather herself and began again. Your father was not the man they said he was. I have believed so for some time. One day, when I am sure of my ground, I will say more. Until then, go, and let no man living tell you what you are worth." Sovrain did not understand her, and she was too weary to ask. She left 2 days later. The Dowager Duchess watched the carriage carry her down the winding cliff road until it vanished into the grey, and then she went home and unlocked a drawer she had not opened since her husband's death. In the weeks that followed, Caelan Thorncroft discovered something he had never once imagined possible. He discovered that his name could not buy him peace, and that it could not, it turned out, protect him from consequence either. The story of the Winter Assembly ran through every parlour in the kingdom. Wherever he went, conversation stopped and resumed with a different edge. Mothers who had once steered their daughters toward him now drew them quietly away. Then came the blow he had not foreseen. His late father, Duke Corwin, had held the office of magistrate over the county, a seat of honour that had passed to Caelan upon his death, and the Lord Lieutenant of the Crown, unwilling to keep a man so publicly disgraced upon the bench, sent a cool and courteous letter relieving him of the duty. The office his father had carried with such gravity was taken from him in a single paragraph. There was no fortune in the world that could buy it back. Hardest of all was his mother. She did not cast him off, for he was her son and her only heir, but she would not receive him. His letters came back unopened. When he rode to the great house, she had the doors closed against him, and he stood in the rain on the steps where he had played as a boy and was not let in. Month after month the silence held. "Why?" he asked the steward at last through the closed door on the third such visit. "Will she not see me?" "Her Grace says she will see you when you have become a man she is not ashamed to look upon. She bids me say nothing further." He went away, and he sat with that a long time, and slowly, against every habit of his life, he began to wonder what such a man might even look like. He told himself at first that the girl was nothing, that the moment would be forgotten by spring. But spring came, and it was not forgotten, and neither was she. He kept hearing the steady way she had looked at him. He kept hearing the words she had spoken without once raising her voice. "I would rather keep my self-respect than purchase comfort with it." He had never met a soul who valued anything above what he could give them. The strangeness of it would not leave him in peace. He learned through a clerk he paid for the knowing that she had gone to the city and kept the accounts for a shipping merchant named Aldous Carrow, a man of sober reputation, and that she was spoken of by everyone who met her as the most capable young woman in his establishment. Caelan told himself the feeling that rose in his chest at the news was indifference. He knew that it was not. So he travelled to the city under a quieter name than his own. He did not announce himself. He did not summon her with a letter. He did not arrive in his grandest carriage to crush her with his consequence. He took rooms near the harbour, and he watched from a distance the life she had built. He saw her walk to the merchants' offices each morning with a ledger beneath her arm. He saw the dock workers tip their caps to her, the clerks making their way at the door. He saw her laugh with a flower seller on the corner, and the sound of it reached him across the busy street and lodged itself somewhere beneath his ribs. She was admired here. Not for a father's name, which no one in the city knew, and not for any fortune, which she did not have, but for herself alone. He had told her she was nothing. He had been wrong in a way that shamed him to the bone. He might have gone on watching her forever, a coward at a safe distance, had a runaway cart not changed everything in the space of a heartbeat. It happened on a grey morning near the harbour. A horse took fright at a falling crate and bolted, dragging its cart through the crowded street, scattering baskets and people before it. Sovrain had been crossing the road. She turned at the shout, too late to run. Caelan did not think. He was across the street before he knew he had moved, and he caught her by the arm and pulled her back against the wall of a chandler's shop as the cart thundered past, so close the wind of it dragged at her skirts. They stood pressed together against the cold stone, both of them breathing hard, and when she looked up to thank the stranger who had saved her, the gratitude froze upon her face. "You," she said, "Lady Sovrain." He released her at once and stepped back, as though afraid she might think he meant to keep her. "Forgive me. There was no time." "What are you doing here?" She had gone pale, but her voice held steady. "Have you come to humiliate me a second time?" The word struck him harder than his mother's hand had done. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "I deserve a great deal worse. I came because I could not stay away, only to see that you were well, nothing more. I have thought of nothing but what I said to you every single day for half a year. I was a vain and stupid man, and I wounded you for the crime of being braver than I was. I have lost my seat on the bench because of it. My mother will not look at me, and I tell you plainly that I have earned every part of it." Sevraine stared at him. Whatever she had braced herself to feel toward Duke Caelan Thorncroft, it had not been this. The arrogance was simply gone from his face, and in its place was something she had never seen there before, a weariness, and beneath it, real and unmistakable, shame. "Words are easily spoken," she said at last, "especially by men accustomed to being believed." "Then do not believe them," he answered. "Believe what you see. I ask nothing of you. I expect nothing at all." He bowed, more deeply and more honestly than he had ever bowed to anyone, and turned to go. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She did not know why she had spoken. Perhaps it was the memory of his hand pulling her clear of the cart, the first wholly unselfish thing she had ever known him to do. "Mr. Carrow holds a supper for his clerks on Thursday next," she said. "There will be no dukes there. If you wish to learn what it is to be measured for yourself and not for your name, you may come, as a guest of no consequence, as a man called simply Caelan, who keeps his accounts like the rest of us." "I would be honored," he said. The supper was a modest affair in the back room of the merchant's house, plain food and good wine, and the loud, easy talk of people who worked for their bread. Caelan came in a borrowed coat without his crest, and at first he did not know how to speak to any of them, for he had never in his life addressed a single soul who was not above him or beneath him. He sat stiffly. He answered when spoken to. And then the old clerk on his left, a man named Pell with grey in his whiskers, asked him plainly whether he had ever buried anyone he loved, and Caelan, caught off his guard, said that he had buried his father. The old man nodded and said he had buried 2 sons to the sea, and somehow, from that, the talk grew real, and Caelan found himself listening to a grief far larger than his own, told without bitterness by a man who still found reasons to laugh. He had never once stood as an equal among such people. He found to his surprise that he did not want the evening to end, and Sevraine, watching him from across the table, felt the hard thing in her chest begin, against her own will, to soften. It was during those quiet weeks in the city that Caelan began the work that would change all their lives. He had come meaning only to be near her, but the more he learned of her, the more one question gave him no rest. She spoke of her father rarely, and always with a low and private shame, as of a man who had truly done wrong. Yet nothing else about her suggested she came from dishonest blood. He could not make the daughter and the crime fit together. And so, telling no one, he began to look quietly into the ruin of the house of Vesperis. What he found turned his stomach. The fraud that had broken Lord Ansel Vesperis 4 years before rested entirely upon a single set of documents, letters and ledgers, said to prove the man had cheated his partners. Caelan, who had now spent half a year among real books kept by an honest hand, sent for copies of those old papers, and saw at once what no idle nobleman had ever troubled to see. The figures did not flow as a true book flows. They had been built backward, from the conclusion to the cause, every entry chosen to arrive at a guilt decided in advance. They were a forgery, a clever one, and they had been laid before the magistrates by a man whose reputation was so spotless that no one had thought to ask a single question of him. That man was Lord Halvard Brevenshaw. Caelan sat a long while with that knowledge, the candle burning low. He remembered Brevenshaw's old and patient claim upon a portion of the Thorncroft lands, a claim resting upon a marriage contract said to bear the late Duke's own signature. A shape began to rise out of the dark. Ansel Vesperis had been his father's friend and his man of business. If Vesperis had discovered that contract to be forged, if he had meant to expose it, then a man like Brevenshaw would need him silenced, and disgrace is a far quieter weapon than murder. The pieces fit so neatly that the fitting itself frightened him. There was one person living who could tell him whether he was right. He rode home to Bramblemere Hollow, and this time, when he stood upon the steps in the rain, he did not ask to be forgiven. He gave the steward a single message. "Tell my mother that I have found the truth about Lord Ansel Vesperis, and tell her that I believe she has known it far longer than I have." For a long moment there was nothing but the rain. The door opened. The Dowager Duchess received him in the cold drawing-room, and for a long while she only looked at him, this son she had not spoken to in many months. Then she crossed to the drawer she had unlocked the day Sivrain left and drew out a packet of her late husband's papers. "Sit down," she said. "You have grown, I think. We shall see how much." What she told him confirmed every fear. Her husband, the late Duke Corwin, had learned near the end of his life that Brevenshawe's claim upon the lands rested on a forgery, and that Brevenshawe had destroyed Ansel Vesperis to bury the fact. He had learned it, and he had been afraid, and he had done nothing, for Brevenshawe held other secrets of the family besides, and the old Duke had chosen quiet over justice and carried the shame to his grave. Mireia had found the proof among his papers only after his death. Too late to save Vesperis, already 4 years buried. Too uncertain of her ground to move openly against a man the whole court adored. "And so I held my tongue," she said, "and despised myself for holding. And then one winter night I watched my own son look at that man's orphaned daughter and call her nothing, and tell 100 people he could marry 100 like her. Her voice did not tremble, but her hands did. I struck you for your cruelty, Kaelin. But I struck you also for your father, and for myself, and for every coward who ever knew a true thing and was too comfortable to say it aloud." Kaelin knelt by her chair, as he had not done since he was a boy. "Then let us not be cowards any longer," he said. "Either of us." For a moment something eased in the old woman's face, but the matter was already being taken out of their hands. Brevenshawe had heard that the disgraced young duke was in the city asking questions about old documents, and a man who has built his entire life upon a buried crime does not sleep easy when he hears a spade strike earth near the grave. He struck first, and he struck to destroy them both. He revived the old slander against Sivrain and dressed it in fresh clothes, whispering through the court that the fallen duke now kept a ruined merchant's bookkeeper as his mistress in the city, that the house of Thorncroft had sunk into open squalor, and that he, Brevenshawe, as the family's nearest honest connection, ought by every right to take the disputed lands into his own steadying hands at last. He meant to ruin Kaelin's name past all mending, to seize the estate by manoeuvre, and to grind the Vesperis girl into the dirt a second time, all in one clean stroke. Kaelin went to her on the harbour wall, where she sometimes walked when the day's work was done, and the ships came in beneath a pewter sky. "I must tell you something," he said, "and I must tell you all of it, for I have already kept too much from you." He told her everything: the forged ledgers and the false contract, his father's cowardice and his mother's guilt, the slander Brevenshawe was, at that very hour, spreading through the court. And last of all, watching her face by the grey light off the water, he told her the thing that mattered above the rest. "Your father was innocent," he said gently. "He cheated no one. He was destroyed because he was honest, by a man who feared what he knew. For 4 years you have carried a shame that was never yours and never his." Sivrain had gone white as the foam below them. She gripped the cold stone of the wall, and the sea wind tore at her hair, and for a long time she could not speak at all. She had been ashamed of her father, in the secret of her own heart, every single day for 4 years. She had rebuilt their name, believing the stain upon it was earned. To learn now that he had been a good man, wronged and silenced and left to die of it, was a grief and a deliverance so tangled together that she could not tell where one ended and the other began. "Then it was all a lie," she said at last, very low. "Every door that closed against us, every whisper. I was ashamed of him. I stood at his grave, and I was ashamed of him." Her voice broke once, and she mastered it. "And the man who did it has dined at the king's table for 4 years, beloved of everyone, while my father lay rotting beneath a lie no one ever questioned." "Yes," Kaelin said, And if you tell me to take this no further, to shield you from a second ruin, I will obey you and spend whatever I have left to protect your name from a distance. But I will not lie to you, Sovereign. I do not want to go. I want to stand beside you and burn his lie to the ground. Tell me to fight or tell me to leave. But know that I am yours to command, either way." She turned from the sea and looked at him, and the grief in her face had hardened into something else, steady and bright and wholly without fear. "We will not run," she said. "I ran once, and it served me, but I am done with running. Brevenshaw has used my father's silence for 4 years, because the dead cannot speak for themselves. Well, I am not dead. I am not silent. And I am no longer a frightened girl at a winter ball." She lifted her chin. "We go back to Bramblemere Hollow, all of us. We stand before the court that watched me shamed, and we let them watch something else entirely. Let Brevenshaw make his accusations to my face. I should dearly like to see how his lies fare in the daylight with the daughter of the man he buried standing in front of him." Kaelin looked at her, and a slow wonder spread across his face. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," he said. "Yes," Sovereign agreed. "You ought to have considered that before you offered to marry 100 of me." And for the first time in his life, the Duke laughed at himself, freely and without a shred of pride. And the sound was so honest that Sovereign found herself, even through her grief, smiling back at him. They returned to the duchy as the first frost silvered the emerald hills, nearly a full year after the night of the slap. The court assembled once more in the great glass conservatories, summoned by the Dowager Duchess herself, who had not lost her power to make the kingdom come when she called. The rain fell against the panes, as it always did. The candles burned. The most influential families gathered to see what new scandal the House of Thorncroft would furnish them. Lord Halvard Brevenshaw was there, smooth and smiling, certain of his victory, beloved as ever. He rose before the assembly and spoke his poison with the easy grace of a man who had never once been doubted in his life. He spoke of the Duke's disgrace, of the bookkeeper he had taken up with, of the shame brought upon an ancient name, and of his own sorrowful duty to set the family's lands in honest hands. The court listened, and many nodded along, for who would not believe the conscience of the kingdom? And Sovereign stood at Kaelin's side and did not flinch, just as she had not flinched before. When Brevenshaw had finished, the Dowager Duchess rose. "My Lord Brevenshaw," she said, "you have spoken a great deal of honesty tonight. Let us have some. For years you have claimed a portion of these lands by a marriage contract bearing my late husband's signature." She drew the old papers from within her gown. "I have had that signature examined by the finest hand in the kingdom and set beside letters my husband truly wrote. It is forged. The contract is false, and was false from the very day you made it." A murmur ran through the hall. Brevenshaw's smile held, though something tightened behind it. "An old woman's grief," he said smoothly, "will find forgery in any honest ink. This is beneath you, Your Grace." "Then let us speak of something harder to wave away," said Kaelin, stepping forward, and the whole court turned to the son they had all written off. 4 years ago, Lord Ansel Vesperis was charged with fraud and ruined upon the strength of certain ledgers. I have studied those ledgers. I have spent this past year among honest books and honest men, and I tell you, as one who has at last learned the difference, that those ledgers were never kept by any living merchant. They were built backward by a forger, line upon line, to prove a guilt chosen before the first figure was ever set down. They are the work of the same hand and the same cold mind that forged the contract my mother holds in her grasp." He turned to the assembly, and his voice rang through the glass. "Lord Ansel Vesperis cheated no one. He discovered that contract to be false. He meant to say so, and he was destroyed before he could draw breath to speak. He was an innocent man, murdered by disgrace, and the man who murdered him has sat at your tables and drunk your trust for 4 years, while his victim's daughter scrubbed her own hearth in exile." The conservatory had gone utterly silent. Every eye moved from Kaelin to Brevenshaw, who had risen halfway from his chair, and whose face, for the first time in living memory, had lost its composure entirely. "This is slander," he said too loudly. "I will not stand here to be accused by a disgraced boy and a grieving widow upon the word of a ruined girl." "Then answer the documents," said the Dowager Duchess, her dark eyes terrible upon him. "Here, now, before the court. Explain how a man's signature came to rest on a contract he never signed. Explain why a merchant's true ledger should run backward, like a tale told from its ending. We are all of us waiting, my lord. Surely the conscience of the kingdom can account for a little ink." He could not. He stammered of conspiracy and forgery in the other direction, of an old woman's malice and a fallen house's revenge, but his words came faster and thinner, and with each one the faces around him changed. These were people who had trusted him without reserve, and there is no anger on earth like the anger of those who learn they have been made fools of by a man they admired. The longer he spoke, the lower he sank, until at last a great lord of the court, an old ally of his own, rose and said coldly that he had heard enough, and that the matter must go before the Crown's commissioners, and that Lord Brevenshaw would be wise to remain within the county until it did. Brevenshaw looked around the silent hall and found not one friendly face in all of it, and he understood that the thing he had spent a lifetime building had collapsed in the space of a quarter hour. He left the conservatory without another word. The commissioners came for his papers within the month. He was stripped of his honours and his lands, and was never received in that country again. The forged contract was burned. The charge against Lord Ansel Vesperis was struck from every record, his name restored, and it was ordered read aloud in the very county where he had been shamed that he had died an innocent and an honest man. Sevraine stood through all of it very straight and very still. Only when she heard her father at last named honest before the assembled kingdom did she let the tears come, and she let them fall freely, for there was no shame in these. In the hush that followed, when the court had broken into 100 astonished conversations, Calen turned to her and found that he had nothing left to prove and everything left to ask. "I will not offer you my title," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "I will not offer to lift you from any gutter, for you were never in one, and I see now that you stood always far above me. I have only this: I love you, not for what you might become to me, but for what you already are. I have spent this year trying to become a man my mother could look upon without shame, and somewhere in the trying I became a man who cannot imagine a single day without you in it. I have no right to your heart, but I had to say so in this room, where I once said something so much less worthy of you." Sevraine looked at him, this man who had once been so certain of his own consequence, and now stood before the kingdom asking for nothing but the chance to be honestly refused. "When I left this place," she said, "I told myself I would never again dream of being a duchess, and I do not. I dream of something else now. I dream of a love built upon humility and trust, and a devotion that does not waver when it is tested." She paused. "I did not think I would find it in you, of all the men in the world. It astonishes me still." "Then you have found it," he said. "Whether you will choose it is another matter, and that I leave wholly to you, as I should have left everything to you from the very first." She was quiet for a long moment. The rain fell against the glass, and the candles burned, and the whole court held its breath. "Ask me properly," she said at last. "Not as a duke, as the man who keeps accounts, as Calen, who learned at last to listen." He went down upon one knee before the entire assembly, before the very nobles who had watched her humiliated, and he asked her to be his wife. Not because he could marry 100 like her, but because there had only ever been one. And this time she said yes. The bells of the cliffside chapel rang out across the emerald hills in the spring of the following year, and the silver sea threw back the sound, and even the endless rain held off for one golden afternoon to let them wed. Before the vows, Sevraine walked alone to her father's grave, where a new stone had been set bearing his name without its old shadow, and she stood there a while in the quiet, and what passed between her and the honest dead was hers, and hers alone. 3 years later, the great glass conservatories of Bramblemere Hollow shimmered again, though not for any grand assembly. They had been given over to gentler purposes now. Sevraine kept the accounts of the whole duchy herself, for she had a finer head for figures than any steward her husband had ever employed, and the estate had never been so prosperous, nor its people so contented. The Dowager Duchess, grown older and softer, and lighter, it seemed, than she had been in many years, sat most afternoons among the orange trees with a small child upon her knee, a dark-eyed boy not yet 2 years old, who could not yet read a single word nor grasp a single thing the grown folk said, and who cared for nothing in all the world but the bright fruit above him and the warm sound of his grandmother's voice. Caelan found them there one evening as the light turned to gold through the rain-streaked glass. He had been out among the tenant farmers all day, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his fine name set aside for honest work, and he was the better man for it. He stooped and lifted his son into his arms, and the boy laughed, and Sivrain came to stand beside them with a ledger still open in her hand. "You are late," she said, but she was smiling. "I am exactly where I ought to be," he answered. "It only took me a great while to find the road." The Dowager Duchess watched the three of them against the silver sea, and she thought of a winter night some years gone, of a slap that had echoed through a silent hall, and of a man 4 years in his grave whose name was clean at last. She had carried a heavy thing for a very long time, and she had set it down, and she found she could look upon her son now without any shame at all. He had needed only someone worth the lesson, and a truth worth speaking, and in the end he had found them both in the same brave woman. The rain fell soft against the glass, and the candles were lit one by one against the coming dark, and in the warm and shining conservatory the family stayed close together while the long evening settled gently over the hills. If this story moved you, stay a while, and let me tell you another.